Imagine boarding a flight, expecting nothing more than a routine journey, only to find yourself in the center of a shocking confrontation. This is exactly what happened to one man, a successful black businessman traveling for work, who never anticipated the ordeal that awaited him in the skies. Everything seemed normal as he settled into his first-class seat, but the atmosphere shifted when the flight crew began acting strangely. At first, it was subtle, curt responses, dismissive looks, and an air of unease. But soon their actions became outright hostile, and their true intentions were impossible to ignore. What began as passive-aggressive remarks quickly escalated into an appalling act of abuse. The crew's actions not only targeted the man, but also crossed every imaginable boundary of professionalism and decency. To the disbelief of other passengers, the situation spiraled into a shocking demand. They instructed him to parachute off the plane mid-flight. The absurdity of the demand left everyone stunned, but what unfolded next would prove to be even more unbelievable. Despite the humiliation and outrage, the man refused to be intimidated. His composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos around him, and he began to strategize his next move. Passengers whispered among themselves, unsure of how to react or whether they should intervene. The tension in the cabin grew unbearable, and it became clear that this was no ordinary conflict. The man's next actions would change the trajectory of this flight and leave everyone on board questioning how such a situation could have even occurred. As the plane continued cruising at 30,000 feet, all eyes were on him, waiting to see how he would respond to such blatant injustice. Little did they know, his bold decision would turn the situation completely upside down. As the tension thickened in the cabin, the man sat quietly, his sharp mind piecing together the events leading to this bizarre and deeply troubling situation. He thought back to the beginning of the flight, replaying every interaction with the crew. From the moment he boarded, there had been a subtle air of judgment in their eyes, something he had sadly encountered before, but never to this extreme. He was no stranger to challenges, having built his career from the ground up, facing obstacles many wouldn't dare to imagine. But this was something different altogether. The other passengers, seated nearby, began exchanging nervous glances. Some clutched their phones, wondering if they should record the escalating confrontation, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they should intervene. Whispers of disbelief traveled through the cabin as people questioned how such behavior could be happening in front of them. Yet, no one dared to stand up, paralyzed by the fear of making the situation worse. Meanwhile, the flight attendants, seemingly emboldened by one another, continued their antagonistic behavior. One crew member muttered under their breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, something about entitlement and special treatment. The man's calm exterior never wavered, but inside, he was a storm of emotions. He had spent years advocating for equity and fairness, but now he was living through a blatant act of discrimination in one of the most public spaces imaginable. As the flight continued, the unease in the cabin was palpable. The man knew he had a choice to make. He could let this play out and become another story of silent injustice, or he could do what he had always done, stand up for what was right. What he chose to do next would leave an indelible mark on everyone witnessing this extraordinary moment. The silence in the cabin grew heavier as the minutes dragged on, broken only by the occasional ding of the overhead announcements or the low hum of the engines. Passengers sat in awkward unease, their eyes darting between the man and the flight crew. Some were angered by the blatant disrespect being displayed, while others looked away, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. The man remained seated, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone exuded a quiet authority that seemed to unnerve the crew. A woman sitting a few rows behind him whispered to her companion, "Why aren't they stopping this? Isn't there a protocol for situations like this?" Her friend, nervously adjusting their seatbelt, shook their head. "They're supposed to de-escalate, not make it worse," they replied, stealing glances toward the aisle where one of the crew members stood, arms crossed, glaring at the man. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It felt personal, calculated. But why? No one could understand the intensity of their animosity. Meanwhile, in the galley, a younger attendant hesitated, clearly uneasy with the unfolding events. "Are we really going through with this?" she asked one of her colleagues, her voice low but trembling. "This doesn't feel right. He hasn't done anything wrong." The senior crew member brushed her off with a wave of the hand. "Stay out of it," they muttered. "You're new. You don't get how this works." But the doubt in her eyes lingered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. The man glanced toward the cockpit door, his mind racing with options. He wasn't sure how far this would escalate, but one thing was clear: he had to stay composed. Years of experience had taught him that losing control was never the answer, no matter how justified it felt. Still, beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The stakes were higher than anyone in that cabin realized, and the next move could change everything. The tension in the cabin thickened as the senior flight attendant, emboldened by the lack of immediate intervention, stepped closer to the man's seat. Her voice, laced with authority and irritation, carried through the aisles. "Sir, if you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to take further action." The ambiguous threat hung in the air, sending ripples of unease among the passengers. The man, calm but resolute, locked eyes with her. "Comply with what exactly?" "I've done nothing to warrant this treatment," he replied, his voice measured but firm. His words resonated with those watching, many of whom silently questioned how this situation had spiraled so far. A child a few rows up whispered to their parent, "Why are they being mean to him?" The parent hushed the child, their own discomfort evident. The young attendant from earlier lingered near the galley, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. She could no longer ignore the injustice playing out before her. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward and spoke, her voice shaking but determined. "I think we're making a mistake. He hasn't broken any rules. We should de-escalate." The senior attendant shot her a sharp look, silencing her mid-sentence. "This is not your concern," she hissed, but the passengers noticed the exchange, and whispers began to spread. The man glanced at the young attendant, a flicker of gratitude in his otherwise stoic expression, but his focus quickly shifted as he spotted movement near the cockpit. One of the crew members was whispering to the pilots, their gestures animated and urgent. The man's instincts told him this was far from over, and whatever decision was being made behind that locked door could define the outcome of this ordeal. A passenger in the back, emboldened by the growing murmurs, stood up and spoke loudly. "This is wrong. Why are you targeting him?" The cabin grew quieter as all eyes shifted toward the speaker. For the first time, the man saw that he was not alone. The room was changing, and with it, the fragile power dynamic was beginning to tilt. The senior attendant, caught off guard by the sudden defiance, faltered for a moment before barking orders to the crew. But the momentum was shifting, and the climax of this confrontation was just moments away. The tension in the cabin continued to rise as more passengers began to question the flight crew's actions. The man, still seated but alert, noticed a growing sense of solidarity among the passengers. Yet, just as it seemed the crowd's collective voice might force the crew to back down, the pilot's voice echoed over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a situation that requires immediate attention. We will be making an unscheduled landing to resolve the matter. Please remain seated." The announcement sent a ripple of confusion and anxiety through the cabin. An unscheduled landing? Where? Why? The man remained calm, but his eyes narrowed as he realized this was no ordinary detour. The senior flight attendant, regaining her composure, smirked as if victory was imminent. The young attendant, who had earlier tried to intervene, glanced nervously at the man, her expression a mix of fear and regret. As the plane began its descent, the man's instincts told him this was part of a larger effort to silence him. He reached for his phone, but the senior attendant quickly stopped him. "No devices, sir," she said sharply, her tone laced with authority. He locked eyes with her, refusing to be intimidated, but complied for now. Passengers began whispering among themselves, speculating about what was happening. The man overheard snippets of their conversations, some supportive, others questioning the gravity of the situation. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a group of men seated at the front of the plane exchanging subtle glances. They weren't wearing uniforms, but something about their coordinated behavior felt deliberate. Were they security personnel? Or something else entirely? As the plane touched down at a remote airstrip, the man braced himself. This wasn't just about the confrontation on board, it was something bigger. The doors opened and outside, a group of uniformed officers waited on the tarmac. The senior attendant gestured toward the man, her smirk returning. But just as she stepped forward to make her move, a sudden announcement from the young attendant stopped her cold. "This man has done nothing wrong, and I have proof." Her words hung in the air, shocking everyone. The officers hesitated, the senior attendant froze, and the man turned to look at the young woman, now trembling but standing firm. Whatever she had just revealed was about to change everything, but the stakes had never been higher. The cabin fell silent as every eye turned to the young flight attendant, whose trembling hands now held a device. "I recorded everything," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The senior flight attendant's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. "You've gone too far," the young woman continued, addressing her superior. "This isn't just unethical, it's illegal." The uniformed officers, initially poised to act against the man, paused in confusion. One of them approached the young attendant cautiously. "If you have evidence, show it to us," he said firmly but fairly. The young woman nodded and handed over her phone. A tense few minutes passed as the officers reviewed the footage. The video clearly showed the senior attendant's abuse of power, her baseless accusations, and the crew's coordinated attempts to intimidate the man. It also captured the man's calm, composed demeanor throughout the ordeal. The lead officer turned toward the man with an apologetic expression. "Sir, we owe you an apology. You've done nothing wrong, and you're free to continue your journey." A wave of relief washed over the passengers, and many began clapping in support of the man and the brave young attendant. The senior flight attendant tried to protest, but the officer silenced her with a stern look. "We'll be investigating this incident thoroughly. You'll need to answer for your actions." Just as the man gathered his belongings, preparing to leave the plane, he turned to the young attendant. "You risked everything to do the right thing," he said. "Thank you." The young woman smiled, though tears welled in her eyes. The passengers erupted into applause once more, celebrating the victory of integrity over injustice. But as the man stepped off the plane, he paused. A black car had pulled up on the tarmac, and a man in a suit emerged, his expression serious. "Mr. Carter," he said, addressing the passenger by name. "We need to talk. This isn't over yet." The man nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken, and climbed into the car. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready. As the car sped away from the plane, Mr. Carter sat quietly, his mind piecing together the events that had unfolded. The man in the suit, an official from the airline's corporate office, spoke calmly but firmly. "We've reviewed the footage, and this incident has shaken our entire operation. What happened to you was unacceptable, and we're taking immediate action to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." Mr. Carter listened carefully as the official explained the steps being taken, terminating the senior flight attendant's employment, offering mandatory training to all staff, and implementing new accountability measures. While the airline couldn't undo what had happened, it was clear they were committed to addressing the systemic issues exposed by the incident. A few weeks later, Mr. Carter received an invitation to speak at an airline industry conference. The young flight attendant who had exposed the abuse stood alongside him, now an advocate for workplace ethics and passenger rights. Together, they shared their story, emphasizing the importance of courage and accountability. The audience, a mix of airline executives, crew members, and regulators, listened intently, moved by the message of change. Back home, life slowly returned to normal for Mr. Carter, but he often reflected on that day. It wasn't just about standing up for himself, it was about standing up for fairness and integrity. The viral video of the incident had sparked conversations worldwide about respect and equality, creating ripples far beyond the confines of that plane. As for the young flight attendant, she became a symbol of bravery in the face of wrongdoing. Her actions inspired others to speak up and hold those in power accountable. And while Mr. Carter had no plans to dwell on the past, he knew that their story had made a difference, a reminder that even in moments of adversity, one act of courage can spark change.